As America has entered into an industrial age, they have seen the growth of the American city. They have seen the growth of industry. They've seen a lot of different types of people working in factories and mills. At the same time, we have seen these poor laborers, these working class Americans, begin to advocate for things like an 8-hour workday, a living wage, some form of insurance or protection if they are hurt or dismembered or even killed in their jobs. Now, as these things are taking place, we see the rise of a populist movement. This idea that the working class people should become involved in politics and advocate for their needs. Now, in this lesson, we're going to talk about the growth of cities, immigrants, and the nation. And this time period will cover 1880 to about 1914, so just before the First World War. Now, immigrants had been coming to this new world, this United States, since the United States was founded. But there's an immigration trend that we see taking place in the late 19th century that's really global. Europeans moved to places like Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and Cuba. Asians migrate throughout Asia and throughout the Pacific. The British and Irish migrants moved throughout the British Empire. So this is a time of great movement globally. Reasons for migration included land and job opportunities. Though most immigrants moved voluntarily, some Chinese, Mexican, Italian, and other workers moved throughout the world bound by labor contracts. So there is a lot of movement globally, some by force and the majority by free will. People seeking new opportunities for jobs, new ways of life, the ability to start over. But for some folks, they are bound by labor contracts. This is not the same as slavery as it had been, but still a form of servitude. Now, the immigrants to the United States during this particular time came from new regions, particularly Southern and Eastern Europe, as opposed to Western Europe, like Great Britain, France. Immigrants, many of whom were Catholic and Jewish, entered into an entirely new cultural setting when they came into the United States. They had very little knowledge of English, and most were very poor. They worked very hard to take advantage of the opportunities that were presented by this new country. Between 1860, which again is the beginning of the Civil War, through 1924, just over 450,000 Mexican workers immigrated to the United States. They got jobs in southwestern mines, mills, and construction sites. Cubans, Bahamians, and Spaniards moved to Florida to work in cigar factories, and Japanese migrants moved to the West Coast, often by way of Hawaii. By 1910, 1/3 of the U.S. population was foreign-born or a first-generation American. Again, 1/3 of all people in the United States by 1910 were either born in another country or were the first person in their family to be born in the United States. Immigrants made up the vast majority of the population in cities like New York, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. Immigrants typically had political, religious, or economic reasons for moving into the United States, and almost all of them were very poor. The U.S. railroad and steamship companies capitalized on this by emphasizing America's economic opportunities in their European advertisements. Many immigrants did not consider coming to the United States to be a permanent move. More than a third of those who arrived between 1875 and 1919 returned back to their country of origin after making enough money to establish a better lifestyle. So again, the rail industries, the steamship companies really aggressively target the poorer populations in other countries and encourage them to come to the United States to work and labor in factories and mills in the United States. For these immigrants who take advantage of these opportunities, they believe this will be a short-term solution to the challenges that they are facing in their home countries. Those who stayed, including Jews, Mexicans, Czechs, and Japanese, often had been the victims of religious or political persecution in their home countries. So those who stay in the United States typically stay because they have been targeted and persecuted based on their identity in their country of origin. Now, immigrants typically settled in neighborhoods with others from their home countries, forming what was called a ghetto. Now, a ghetto isn't a bad word, it's just a word that means a neighborhood that is nearly all of the people in that area having the same ethnicity, racial component, or class composition. Communities helped new immigrants to settle and adjust. There were these mutual aid societies that provided assistance to immigrants in paying for insurance, for funerals. They provided social centers which offered immigrants who shared a common heritage the opportunity to get together, to play games, to talk, to share stories from their homelands, and to relax, to just be around like-minded people. For the Chinese in California, mutual aid societies and social centers were often composed of people from the same towns and villages in China. And within these centers, immigrants helped each other to find jobs. They helped each other to mediate conflict and to fight discrimination, as well as to celebrate their own Chinese culture. Now, ethnic ties were strong in these communities, and these communities were all across the country. Each immigrant group established organizations and centers that served its communities' unique economic, educational, social, and cultural needs. So even though we had different groups of immigrants across the country, each town's social center really worked to help the people in that area to navigate those particular communities. Religion provided another important outlet for immigrants, and in the last 35 years of the 19th century, the number of Catholic Church in the United States more than tripled. Churches provided more than simply a religious outlet. They offered clothing, food, and support to those who were struggling. Churches were also responsible for organizing social and cultural opportunities for the community at large. And the church also served for record-keeping purposes and other major life events for the parishioners. Religion itself began to change and fit into this new environment in the United States. Ethnic groups worked to reshape the Catholic Church in the United States to meet their own needs by celebrating patron saints and protectresses from towns from the Old World. Having distinct priests and parishes for each ethnic group, which made possible other changes that conflicted with the Vatican policies. So what we start to see is that the Catholic churches in the United States will be a little different from the Vatican or the main church in Italy. And the reason for this change is that the communities need to hold on to their religious identity as well as their cultural identity, and then they need to find a way to exist and fit into this new country where they live. Religious practice varied for Jews in the United States as well. Reform Judaism, which was founded in Cincinnati, Ohio, relaxed the strict standards of worship, but other Jews maintained their commitment to traditional Orthodox practices. Local newspapers in foreign languages provided residents of ethnic enclaves with the opportunity to keep attuned to local, national, and international events. Between the mid-1880s and 1920, more than 3,500 new foreign language newspapers began publication. So even though these various immigrant people are coming into this new country, they are really trying to stay connected to the old world and staying connected with what's going on in the old world. Now, we also see that in these immigrant communities, there was a firm foundation for petty crime, for gangs, and for ethnic clashes, as well as organized crime groups, which were connected to the international syndicates. Now, what I want you to recognize is that many immigrants in the United States at this particular time were very fearful of going outside of their community for any type of help. So it was very easy to rob someone within your own community because they would not be willing to seek out the police for assistance. Poverty, tight living quarters, and family problems shaped immigrant experiences as well. Husbands earned a reputation for drunkenness and abusiveness. Boarders posed threats of unwanted sexual advances to the women of the homes that they were renting rooms in. And different generations within families also begin to clash over conflicting expectations of American life. So the older immigrants really viewed this move to the United States as temporary and really tried to hold on to their old world identities. But many of the newer generations, the younger generations, were growing up and experiencing their formative years in the United States. And as a result of that, they really wanted to kind of shake off some of those old world identities. Mutual aid societies worked to help to ease some of the bureaucratic problems as well as the structural problems that immigrants faced in the United States. They also helped families to navigate problems within their household. So these different organizations within these immigrant communities really tried to help immigrants to navigate the United States, the rules, the customs, the laws, billing, those types of things. Though the U.S. rhetoric touted a nation as a welcoming place, Americans whose families had been in the country for a longer period of time were really dismayed by this influx in immigration. Now, this doesn't just mean Western European immigrant families who had come to the United States in the 1600s. This includes those who had come to the United States in the early 1800s. They were very frustrated with this increase in immigration near the end of the 1800s because what they saw was all of these people coming from different countries and they viewed them as competition for resources, to include jobs, housing, and food, even though they themselves had once been new immigrants in the United States. Industrialists viewed immigrants as cheap, exploitable labor, which bred contempt from the older industrial workers. Small pockets of radicalism within the large wave of immigrants fed the anxieties about anti-American sentiment. So the industrialists, the wealthy business owners, saw immigrants as a cheap labor source. But the older people, even in the same immigrant communities, were hostile to these newer immigrants because what they saw was someone who would be willing to work for a cheaper wage. At the same time, in these immigrant groups that are coming into the United States, there would be these pockets of radicalism, people who would come into the United States, but they would not sort of assimilate and take on this new identity of the United States. And so this made Americans be very fearful of these immigrants because they saw them as anti-American. Now, anti-immigrant sentiment isn't a new thing. It has been around since immigrants first came to this new world. But laws and standards throughout U.S. history really worked to deny citizenship as being available to anyone who wasn't white. And over the course of the 19th century, efforts to define what it meant to be an American citizen or what it meant to be white really begins to shape the discussion around citizenship. Radical categoriza- Radical categorization became science in this particular time. Now, science doesn't necessarily uh, always hold true. Sometimes things are passed off as science and they're accepted by scientists in the medical community, and then they are later disproven. But we do see this kind of science of race at this particular time that influences politics. Many people believed that Southern European immigrants were a threat to the capacity for self-government in the United States because criminality, laziness, drunkenness, greed, and thrift were all traits that were not born of social circumstances, but were inborn and unchangeable ethnic character traits. Now, scientific racial division fed the labor strife as the skilled workers really try to keep their wages high, but they are becoming threatened by the unskilled laborers. At the same time, we see a lot of tension in different neighborhoods where heightened middle class residents really begin to blame all of the problems in the urban areas on immigrants. Protestants also begin to feel that their superiority in the faith area is in jeopardy because there are more and more Catholics and Jews coming into the United States. Now, these middle class residents in urban areas recognize that there's been an increase in crime, and they blame this increase in crime on immigrants. And that's not entirely correct. When you have more and more people in one area competing for the same resources, you'll naturally have an increase in crime, but that is not because they are immigrant people. Nativist sentiment, which is this idea that blames foreigners for all threats or dangers or problems that are prevalent in American culture, really begins to escalate as a response to this increase in immigration. Now, in 1893, Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and other like-minded individuals formed the Immigration Restriction League, which pushed for the exclusion of illiterate adult immigrants. So any immigrant who could not read and write, they would be excluded from coming into the United States. The American Protective Association, which was formed in 1887, hoped to restrict Catholic immigration as well as political and economic opportunities available to Catholics when they arrived in the United States. So we have a situation where people are being targeted based on their education and based on their faith. Nativists at this particular time were really interested in this idea of eugenics, which was a form of biological engineering that sought to reproduce only desirable races. Now, the eugenicists encouraged the sterilization of those who were seen as unfit to reproduce and lobbied for marriage restrictions that would lead to the reproduction of only desirable individuals. So these eugenicists would really advocate for restrictions on the ability to marry unless you could provide for your children, unless you had a certain education level, income level. And they also wanted to make sure that anyone who had any type of disability would not be able to reproduce as well. Some reformers advocated for assimilation of immigrants, just as they had for Native Americans, and encouraged an American-style dress, grooming, and education, and the observance of traditional cultural celebrations in the United States, such as Columbus Day and Thanksgiving. In 1892, Francis Bellamy's Pledge of Allegiance was adopted as a ritual in public schools. So in many areas of society in the United States at this particular time, we see a lot of effort to make sure that people who are coming into the United States are being good American citizens or American residents. Now, this particular image was pretty popular at the time, and it circulated through newspapers and propaganda, and it's called The Stranger at the Gate. And so what we see, here, of course, is the White House and Uncle Sam, which is, indicative of the American government. And then here we have this it looks like a person who might be destitute, a homeless person, and that person is supposed to represent an immigrant. They are homeless and they are seeking a home here in the United States of America. And it says, with them, they are bringing things like disease, poverty, other illness, other religions. So the overall view of immigrants at this particular time was not a positive view. Now, first generation immigrants really struggled to assimilate, but they did change significantly because they adapted to certain aspects of American life. And this really influenced their desire to ensure that their children would become full-fledged Americans. So those first generation immigrants who had come to the United States years earlier really want to raise their children to be good Americans so that they will have better opportunities than they themselves had. In 1808, oops, goodness, there we go. In 18, no, 1908. In 1908, Israel Zangwill wrote a play called The Melting Pot, which illustrated immigrants' goals of mixing together in the United States to become equal to native-born Americans. The play created this notion that the United States had persisted to be this kind of idea where everything would sort of melt together. This notion that all of these different immigrant groups would bring with them different cultures, different religions, customs, faith, tradition, and they would just sort of mix in and melt in here in the United States. Now, this notion was much more idealistic than realistic. As immigrants continued to embrace certain aspects of their culture, many Americans also resisted the notion that immigrants could even assimilate at all. Now, I had a student once who said that rather than a melting pot, maybe it was more like Wendy's chili because we're not really sure what's in there. And that's probably a more accurate description because we have people from all parts of the globe who are coming into the United States for a variety of reasons and bringing with them different traditions and cultures and values and beliefs. And then they are trying to navigate this new world. For African Americans at this particular time, of course, being born in the United States, but having only been considered citizens of the United States since about 1863. For African Americans, this idea of being assimilated in the United States put them into a very important predicament. And W.E.B. Du Bois expressed this difficulty, this challenge, this struggle in 1903 in his book called The Souls of Black Folk, in which he argued that African Americans really felt a sense of two-ness or double consciousness because of their inability to reconcile their African heritage with their history as slaves and free people in America. So, this idea of the melting pot really is very unrealistic, and the more realistic expression or idea is more of a vegetable soup, where you have a lot of very different elements all existing in the same space. Now, with these changes, this time of great immigration in the United States, many Americans believed that the true spirit and identity of the country really lay in the prominence of small independent farms. This was a Thomas Jefferson mantra, this idea of an agrarian paradise where everyone would be a farmer, they would be independent, and they would be able to be self-sufficient. But the shift to increased urbanization left many people feeling very concerned over the future of the country. At the same time, we have seen a major shift in industrialization as well. Like immigration, migration within countries was an international trend. Between 1820 and 1920, about 60 million people worldwide moved from rural areas to urban areas. This is not just in the United States, but in larger, older nations like Britain and France, Germany, other areas. Over the course of the 19th century, the expansion of transportation and communication networks really helped to facilitate the growth of the American city, and it transformed metropolis areas like Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Detroit into very important centers of trade and commerce. So these cities that had really served to be a hub of business really become centers of trade, centers of commerce, areas that anyone who is shipping or receiving any type of good or service will need to be able to move their products through. Migration from the farms to the industrial centers also contributed to the growth of the cities. We see a shift from a lot of um, farm life to more and more people in urban areas. As cities begin to industrialize, they begin to need to use more and more electricity to not only light mills and factories, but also to expand nighttime entertainment. They begin to develop streetcars, which would transport people quickly across the city. They begin to improve their water and sewage in the cities. They begin to construct taller buildings and saw vast advances in public health over the end of the 19th century. Now, as late as just before the Civil War, many of the cities, these cities in places like Chicago, are still tossing out sewage in the street. If you're not sure what sewage means, that's any type of water that you might think of in a restroom is really being tossed out into the street. And so we really start to improve the quality of water and how we handle sewage and dispose of waste. Many of the same causes of urbanization in the Northeast and Midwest spurred the growth in the West as well. Cities began to spring up along the railroad terminals across the country, which way to a greater number of people to begin to move into the western areas. Women also flocked to the cities as mechanization on farms made their labor less significant. At the same time, though, women's work in this particular area, in this particular time, as the homemaker really becomes easier and it becomes more streamlined. So women are still expected to be homemakers and to be caretakers of the home, but they were able to order goods from mail order catalogs from places like Sears and Roebuck. These types of organizations offered goods that women would otherwise have to either make themselves or have shipped in from far away that they couldn't have afforded. Blacks migrated to cities as well, fleeing poverty, discrimination, and racial violence in the rural South. We also see this contribute to a dramatic rise in African American populations in southern cities. So African Americans really leave the sharecropping and tenant farm lives that they have lived after the Civil War into cities in the South and then eventually into cities in the North. Black migrants found their opportunities in the cities, though, were actually very limited due to racial discrimination. So even though northern areas had really worked to end slavery, they did not welcome the black laborer into their organizations. Many blacks found work as janitors or domestic servants, but jobs in certain industries like the cotton mills were completely off limits to African Americans. For some blacks, moving to the cities offered opportunities to start their own independent businesses like funeral parlors, barber shops, and construction companies. Those are organizations that would not have served black patrons at this particular time. Other blacks became professionals who worked and served in their own communities. After 1900, blacks increasingly left the rural South for northern cities, where they really hoped that they could find better job opportunities and freedom away from Southern segregation. But in spite of escaping the segregation of the South, they found that there was a lot of discrimination in northern areas, job restrictions, and then there was residential segregation. So African Americans could only buy or rent homes in areas that were pre-approved, which led to the creation of the African American ghetto. Again, remember the term ghetto is a neighborhood that is an ethnic enclave. African Americans' efforts to thrive in the face of discrimination fueled the creation of a black middle class. Now, this black middle class did amass some wealth. They began to publish newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, and they also created their own mutual aid societies, lodges for men, and clubs for women. Religious institutions within the Black community served social and political functions, as well as promoting freedom from white repression and fostering a middle class notion of respectability that at times really created a lot of conflict between the middle class and the lower class African American church congregants. Now, at the same time that we see significant immigration, we also see that cities begin to grow to accommodate the numbers of people coming into these areas. And they grow vertically, which means up, as well as horizontally, which means wide. So cities begin to increase more square footage, they begin to expand out, but they also build skyscrapers and expand upward. Property values reflected the growth of the city. In Chicago, for example, the value of one piece of property increased from $160 to $800 in the course of the 10 years between the 1870s and the 1880s. In New York City, one lot's value increased 10 times over the course of 40 years. Now, in response, buildings first developed what was called cloud scrapers, which was a 10-story building that was built with cast iron columns. And then later, skyscrapers, which utilized steel and elevators and stretched as many as 30 stories into the air. Now, prior to these cloud scrapers being built, most buildings were 3 stories at most, at best, maybe 4 if you were in a very, very big area, but that was pretty rare. So cloud scrapers are about 10 stories, but then we see 30-story skyscrapers being built. Horizontal expansion was accompanied by transportation innovations, and by 1914, walking cities, cities where people walked everywhere, became riding cities because you could not walk across the city, which means cities went from being a few miles wide to several kilometers wide. There were electronic trolleys as well, which first appeared in Richmond, Virginia. And electricity really made it possible for the subways to provide commuters with the opportunity to ride underground, which meant that there wouldn't be all of the pollution that you saw with the steam engine. Boston's subway system actually opened in 1897. New York opened their subway system in 1904. So these systems really are built because there is a demand. There are enough people that this is needed. Bridges allowed for cities to expand outward with the completion in 1883 of a 13-year project to build the Brooklyn Bridge. And these bridges really become indicative and representative of urban growth. Transportation improvements also fostered the growth of the suburbs in the late 19th century. As members of the middle class, those who had the extra money, decided that they wanted to be able to leave the urban areas to escape the problems that they believe were associated with poor immigrant groups. And so they began to leave the cities and move out into the suburbs. And the various forms of transportation truly made this possible for them. Now we'll pause here and we will pick up with how the other half lived in the next lesson.